I'm going to talk about the pioneering days of British socialism, which provide the backdrop to the historical detective work that has dominated my learning journey. Becoming a socialist was experienced as a momentous event, described as crossing the river of fire, and the playing of tunes popular with socialist groups formed in the 1880s and 1890s as you came into the hall was intended to capture the passionate commitment of the time. In November 1903, for example, two enthusiasts addressed a socialist meeting in Kettering. One was the loveliest woman in England, famous as the long-term love of Edward VII. Wildly indiscreet in word and on paper, she criticised her fellow speaker for making a speech that was flat and unconvincing. What we wanted, confided Lady Warwick, was two good socialist hymns to help us to warm the atmosphere. She was complaining about the fact that they'd got a middle-class audience and that the hymns would have lifted. I have to say, I think the hymns are rather slow, perhaps for present-day taste, but anyway, she thought that would make the difference. The subject of Lady Warwick's missive was Mary Brydges Adams, a formidable activist from South Wales. Tonight, I want to share with you a small part of the story of Mary's life and the historical landscape in which that life was lived, interwoven with personal reflections on biography and the making of history from below. And the montage that's going round, we'll just pick up on various quotes and images that will be threaded through the narrative that's going to follow. So it's just on a continual loop. My concern is with politics at a local or grassroots level. Mary first grabbed me by the throat with a blistering speech she made as an elected member of the London School Board in December 1897. It's actually her first speech that she makes in that forum, and she was trying to gain support for the feeding of school children. And with enormous guts, she effectively told her middle-class opponents that they could not possibly imagine what it was like to be poor. Created under the terms of the 1870 Education Act, the London School Board at the time was the world's largest educational parliament and Britain's most influential school board. Mary was one of 55 elected members controlling nearly 400 schools. In recreating her experience as a participant within the labour movement and as a campaigner for improvements in working class education, I'm attempting to address legacies and to make continuities, to produce a reading of the past from the present for the future. Marxist thinking inspired Mary's dreams of a better world. She developed her political ideas under the influence of William Morris, who's one of the images that you'll see going around on the loop. He was a British writer, designer, artist, and socialist. And for Morris, the way to achieve socialism was first educating people into desiring it, and next organising them into claiming it effectively. And Mary, who later described herself as an unattached communist, said she had Morris's blessings and good wishes when she became involved in popular educational politics. Mary spent 7 years as an elected member of the London School Board, and by 1900 she was well known for her efforts to extend the school life of the majority of children. She excelled as a speechmaker, and this was evident in Bernard Shaw's remark in his letter of condolence to her son, in which he said, "What an orator," he wasn't always actually known for being so kind about women. So, for example, another socialist woman that he mixed with, a woman called Annie Besant, who's going round on that link, and I'll come back to later. He was rather patronising about her, so that comment really does signify something. My title comes from the idea of a radical tradition in English education, a tradition that stresses the relationship between education and social change, using a language of politics drawn from outside teaching. The intention is to focus on Mary's propaganda work in order to explore her contribution to the main project of making socialists from the standpoint of gender. What I want to argue is that an appreciation of Mary's vision not only allows for an examination of areas of experience that are lost in grander narratives, but also serves as a context for a fresh set of perspectives on the place of the educational question in the study of British socialism. So I've crafted the story that I'm going to tell into 6 parts. The first part I'm calling Landscape of a Socialist, and in taking that title, I'm borrowing from the title of a book that many of you may be familiar with. It's called Landscape for a Good Woman by Carolyn Steedman, who's been very influential in my work. The second part I'm going to go on to talk about in order to situate Mary's life and work is Labour politics in London, so I'll gradually be honing in on her. Then I'm going to talk about socialist Woolwich. Then I'm going to talk about the London School Board, clearly with a particular focus on her work in that body. Then I shall be moving on to explore her contribution as a socialist campaigner, moving on to think about independent working class self-organisation and rethinking historical narratives. So I'm going to begin by talking about the landscape in which she grew up. And what I'm wanting to do here is, because one of my interests has always been in political journeys, and I'm wanting to give you a sense of the background in which she grew up and what facilitated the step that she took in terms of stepping into the public sphere. And we have to remember that if we're thinking about that in the late Victorian, early Edwardian period, we're thinking about a moment when, for example, anti-suffrage posters were produced of a female with her tongue sticking out and a large pair of scissors next to it. So that kind of puts into context, I think, you know, the step that one took as a female, stepping into the public arena. So just to give you a little flavour of her social background. Mary was born into a small Welsh working-class family on the 19th of October, 1855. Her father, William Daltrey, had moved from maritime Pembrokeshire to work as an engine fitter in Monmouthshire, which was then a new boom area of iron and coal industry. He and his siblings joined an influx of migrant workers willing to provide the labour force, leading historians of Welsh development at the time to make comparisons between these emergent Welsh industrial towns that were sprouting up and the frontier settlements of the American West. In terms of wider movements that provide the backdrop to her childhood, we have to remember that Chartism, the mass movement for democratic rights, which dominated British politics in the later 1830s and 1840s, followed in the wake of this social and economic change that was going on within Wales at that moment in time. Within living memory, Mary's birthplace had been a meeting point in the Newport Rising of 1839, when it was said that mine owners hid themselves down pits in fear. I've not been able to discover, going back to Dylan's point about the difficulties of recovering sort of little-known figures, I don't know how or where Mary's parents met, but her mother was a woman called Margaret Jones and probably came from very much the same kind of milieu as her father, William. The two had 3 children, Thomas, who was born in 1854, Mary, as I said, in 1855, and a younger brother, Benjamin, born in 1858, who lived only 7 days. And in fact, Margaret, Mary's mother, died 4 days later after his birth. She'd been ill for several months beforehand with pneumonia, and clearly didn't live on, obviously weakened. And she was at the time 37 years old, which again would be relatively late to be having children at that point in time. William remarried in 1860, and then the next moment the family crop up is in the 1871 census for Newcastle, where they're living at the Robin Adair public house, which was along the Scotswood Road, which for those of you who know it has been made famous in the Blaydon Races, which is a Tyneside anthem. And Scotswood Road was a road that apparently had many public houses, and it's this that the song's talking about. And Mary in the census is featured as she was then a pupil teacher. So she's training to teach in the state schools of the time. And her brother Thomas is listed as an apprentice draftsman. And her father, the reason for the move was that he had taken work at the Armstrong factory and is employed as a boilermaker. Now, to continue the theme in terms of thinking about the wider forces that shaped Mary's political outlook, it's important to think about what was happening in 1870s Tyneside, which is a moment when we'd be thinking about popular radicalism. So it's a moment when we're thinking about the campaign amongst workers to win a 9 hours day, particularly strong amongst the engineering workers of the time. And one of the things that was going on in 1871 was that there was a dispute to win the 9 hour day, which included Armstrong himself, the employer, was heavily involved in that and took the decision to employ blackleg workers to bring them in to keep running the factory, and he actually closed the works school and advised the local authorities to refuse to admit the wives of strikers in the laying-in hospital, so they'd be forced clearly to have children at home. So it gives you a sense of kind of the strength of feeling that was shaping her as she's growing through the 1870s. Mary became a head teacher in her 20s, which wasn't unusual at that moment in time. Again, we're thinking of the beginnings of a state education system, a moment when there is rapid growth and expansion in the provision of elementary schools for the working classes, which meant that there were promotion opportunities, and some people did make a rapid elevation through the ranks. So she wasn't necessarily that unusual in becoming a head teacher in her 20s. She went on to teach in Newcastle, Birmingham and London. And again, picking up a point that Dylan mentioned at the start, one of the things that has proved impossible so far is I've not been able to actually name the schools that she taught at beyond the fact that they're referred to as being in the elementary system. The records haven't survived. And I also, therefore, have no sense either of what she was like as a classroom teacher. What I do know is that she was continuing her studies as well as working full-time in the schools. So she was working for an external London BA, and that opportunity had only become available to women in 1878. So again, quickly, she's grabbing the opportunities that are available to her. And what she actually achieves is what was then a recognised qualification that's referred to as an intermediate examination, that would mean that she was halfway towards becoming a BA. She's already becoming involved in socialist politics, and it's as a joint participant in socialist politics that she meets and marries a man named Walter Bridges Adams in 1887. I'm just going to take a... Now, Walter Bridges Adams came from a background of religious dissent and political radicalism. His father was a man called William Bridges Adams, who was a member and closely connected with the radical Unitarian network that was settled on a South Place church in Finsbury. And he was heavily involved in the intellectual groupings that were centred there. And he used journalism to advocate divorce by consent and schemes to liberate women from housework. He wrote in the Radical Unitarians newspaper that was called the Monthly Repository. Now, he married 3 times. He was widowed twice and had 3 children. And his eldest son, who was an ambitious businessman, his papers have survived, and he wrote an unpublished autobiography, and you get a sense of through reading that his father's lack of business acumen frustrated the eldest son. But, I suggest, his writings on political reform provided fertile soil from which the politics of Hope and Walter, his children from his 3rd marriage, would spring. So I'll give you a very, very brief sense of Hope and Walter.